So, thank you for coming to this panel whose title is Privacy and Net Neutrality Mutually Reinforcing. We will try and say something on that. I don't know whether giving answers, but in any case, we are very much proud to be able to engage with you in a discussion, a very interesting discussion, and your support will be valuable. My name is Massimo Attoresi. I work for the EDPS and as an IT policy officer. I'm also the DPO of the EDPS with another hat, and then I'm surrounded by a very distinguished panel. I give the floor to Estelle Masse from Access Now, that I have to thank for organizing this interesting panel.
Thank you, Massimo, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I will be providing some housekeeping notes before letting our speakers get you into the detail of the debate. So we'll be discussing this morning privacy and net neutrality, with the question that we want to address on whether they are mutually reinforcing and what's actually the relationship between these two concepts. To kick off the discussion, Massimo, who agreed to be our chair today, will present some context and general principles in order to have an idea of exactly which topic we're going to dive in. After that, Maryant Fernandez from EDRi will present an overview of the legal situation in Europe and will provide some insight on very specific points on how privacy and net neutrality interconnects. Followed by Raegan MacDonald from Mozilla, who will start diving into the more technical part and explain the role of platform and the role of actors when dealing with both net neutrality and privacy. Then Ben Wagner will present us with more details on a very specific issue that we're going to touch on today, which is deep packet inspection, which is a concept that if you're not familiar with at the moment, don't worry, you will be hopefully at the end of this panel. And our final speaker will be Kheops from FAIMaison, who is an associative ISP, to explain from the technical perspective and from daily management of a network how actually net neutrality and privacy can be both respected in that sense. So in order to start our debate and ensure that we also have a good time for discussion with you, because we want to engage with you and we want to hear from you on the question we're trying to answer today, I'll first give the floor to Massimo.
So, thank you very much, Estelle. Well, I will go through, even though I'm pretty sure you don't need them, basic concepts that are underpinning what we are talking about. Then I will talk about what is going on in the rules, EU regulations landscape. And then, of course, all that will be not just facts, but I also will give the DPS view and our, let's say, position so far on that. First of all, Internet, you know what it is, and you know that it provides a platform for transporting data. This data could be information exchange among users, could be also what is called OTT, let's say, and then service on top of that, which are, for example, IPTV, or could be the simple email, or could be something else, could be just that you give a service on that. So you have a layer that transports your data, and then you have content and service providers that use that infrastructure in order to enable the exploitation of information exchange of info. So at the end of the day, the gate for the internet are what is called the internet access provider, that they will call also ISPs, internet service providers, but that's the same thing, just the acronym I'm using in the slides. And they are just the gate for users to the internet. So they are meant to be the gate to access the network, and that's it as a basic thing. The reality is that they don't do only that, but they also manage the traffic because also of technical needs. But on top of that, they also sometimes interfere with the traffic by slowing down, stopping, or giving prioritization to certain services because, for example, they have some commercial deals with content and service providers, or because sometimes they are the same to offer the access and at the same time the content and the services. And they do it by inspecting the IP packets of the network. You know what they are? There are several envelopes like Matryoshka, one within the other, and they serve for a lot of things, for routing the information in the place where it has to go, once the path is established, to have a secure connection between the 2 points, and then on top of that, you have protocols that enable the services as such. Now, let's go for this concept of net neutrality that was coined the first time in 2003. We go for the narrow definition. Narrow definition is really technical, but we will see. So we have to say net neutrality means that all the traffic is given the same treatment in the internet. No prioritarization, no discrimination based on origin, no discrimination based on the type of data that is there, and other kinds of parameters. Is that just a simple thing, a technical thing? No, it is not. It enables something more. It enables high values, fundamental values that by the are the ones of the Union. For example, democracy, pluralism, the free flows of ideas, human rights, but also participation. And nowadays, the internet brings with it these values because that was one of the main features since the internet stopped to be just a military thing, as a new the added value that it brought with respect to the usual telecommunication, let's say, means. Now, how does privacy fit in? I think it fits in two ways. First of all, because a wider concept of net neutrality, which is linked to the fundamental values where it supports, is that it's just not a technical concept. But in that, you have also the idea of having a secure network, a network where the confidentiality of communication is taken care of, and where the personal data are also protected. Second reason, and that's why we will push on in the panel, is the fact that if you want to perform traffic management, so to influence how packets are dealt with, you have to inspect those packets. You can have a light inspection, we'll go a bit more in depth later on, and then you can have a more in-depth inspections. Go into the payload of the packet and look inside, if you can, and see what the very communication content is in there. Now, that's a bit of provocation. We know that that's always ongoing thingy, whether all the traffic in the internet is personal data. Is it? For example, is the metadata personal data? Well, I believe, okay, let me do the disclaimer because I'm talking also on a personal basis and not officially also on the ban for the EDPS. It's something which goes even to the court, intervention to the court. But I mean, I think that indeed everything goes in, should be considered as personal data as far as the precautions to protect it are concerned. Why? First of all, because metadata themselves are personal data. If you know what kind of website I want to see, if you know what the IP source is, at the end of the day is what the cookies are collecting. So you can build profiles on that, just on the metadata. Furthermore, we cannot know what the packets have inside. So the precautionary principle, I believe, should apply in these cases and consider all the let's say what goes on in the internet as personal data. Whatever the definition of deep packet inspection that the panelists will talk about later could be. Now, announcement. Probably you know that we have a new regulation, let's say, providing for the open internet access in the Union, which has been approved in November 2015. It was a long path for that. It is not just a regulation that deals with net neutrality, but it deals also with the roaming charges. It is a part of the telecom package. It is a very long story, which, for example, started neatly by the way, in 2011 with a clear communication from the Commission on the open internet and net neutrality. We replied to that as EDPS because among our tasks we have also the fact that we will provide advice and on the no proposals of the Commission when it deals with personal data. And then there was a technical consultation of BEREC together of the Commission and there were some findings. In a nutshell, the findings say that one of 5 of the fixed line access providers interfere with the communications, whereas at least 1/3, if not 1/2, of the mobile providers do the same. So there was a new consultation of the Commission, and finally in September 2013, we had the final proposal for a TSM. The co-legislators went on lengthy on that for 2 years, and finally we had this law approved in November. We also issued the official opinion on the proposal of the Commission. Now let's say what we said on that. So first of all, we stated again that monitoring and inspecting, let's say, techniques is in conflict with the fundamental rights, basically with the Article 7 of the Charter, and if we consider all the data inside personal data, also with Article 8 of the Charter, and by the principle of confidential communication that is established by the Privacy Directive. The Privacy Directive is the only secondary law tool of the European legislation that enforces the Article 7 of the Charter. That's why it's very important. We are very keen to maintain those, let's say, assurances in the new reform of the Privacy Directive. So we said that let's look at the lawfulness of traffic management. What are the legal grounds that should be just there and not more than that for traffic management? Okay, delivering the service, that's normal routing, minimize congestion, security. From the Privacy Directive, we also see that some interference could be based on consent, but consent should be valid. Valid means that should be free consent, should be informed consent, real informed, that's a very tricky thing. A prior consent, it should be unambiguous consent. Is that so easy? Imagine, for example, on email communication when you have not only the person that sends the email, but also the other one that replies, that don't know, that have not been warned about, what the ISP of the sender does. So it's a tricky thing. How do you collect the consent of all these people? And there is, let's say, a plugin, the usual plugin for law enforcement that you have for member states. So, member states may restrict rights for state and public security, investigation, prosecution of criminal offenses. Unauthorized use of telcos, that's normal, if necessary and appropriate to a democratic society. So that last piece of sentence is very important, because the interpretation, in our opinion, should be very restrictive. We also say packet inspection right, but less intrusive as possible. For example, if possible, let's stick to the IP addresses and not more than that. Let's see later on whether this is feasible or not. And we called upon BEREC, which is the, let's say, the agency that's the body of the European regulators of electronic communications, also to involve data protection authorities in giving guidance on that. We restated the same thing, roughly, when the proposal came in, again, to explicitly avoid the DPI when possible. And again, we said, well, it's very important that national regulators of telecommunication cooperate with data protection authorities. I don't know whether you know that in the Privacy Directive, who are the authorities to enforce that? There are different authorities depending on the member states. In some member states are the telecom regulators, in some member states are the data protection authorities, so it's not that easy. We are working together, for example, in the Working Party 29 that collects together all the data protection authorities of the Union. But still, this is something to work upon also in the review of the Privacy Directive. Now, let's immediately have a look at the new regulation. Well, the final compromise, I think, in principle is not that bad. There are clearly principles that are stated, but then we will see that there is something more. So, user rights are clear. So there is right to access and provide any content from any equipment, no discrimination on location of user of content. And then transparency measures are quite advanced on contracts, for example, and including on privacy and data protection impact, which is a very big step forward, which means by the end of the day that the ISPs have to perform a risk assessment. Otherwise, how are they able to give the information to the users? At the same time, there are duties from the ISPs that they have to treat all the traffic equally, and very, very important for our talks, that ISPs' commercial practices and conditions shall not limit user rights. That meaning that if you want to give, have some deals with someone, this has to be done without any prejudice for the usual general use of the internet access through your provider. And then a very important statement is that the monitoring of the specific content is not allowed. But if you go on, there is also an article, I don't remember whether it is Article 5, but that says something else, because gives some freedoms to the providers. That are, they can offer services other than internet access which are optimized for specific content or applications to meet service quality requirements. It makes sense in say, but, and facilitate those services only, of course, if network capacity is enough for the general use. The problem comes from the fact, how is it, and the question is it technically possible to not discriminate and at the same time to facilitate someone? What does it mean at the end of the day? We also made a very important comment. No, we made it before, we can reiterate it now, because the three legal bases for allowing traffic management are still the integrity and security of the network, the usual one. The second one, preventing and mitigating congestion, even though preventing is very tricky because you don't have to use it as an excuse to do something strange, and then to comply with Union on legislative legislation. The third one, we put an orange sign in that because it's a very tricky and, let's say, potentially harmful plugin. We will say what, and we will meet this provision with something else someone else has said very recently. We'll see what. Now, that's not all, because the rules are not completely established in the regulation. So, BEREC will establish guidelines by August 2016, consulting all stakeholders, some of which are here now, and then also in order to guidelines in order to implement the rules that you can find in the slide. That is that the regulators have to close monitor and ensure compliance. That they may impose even on the ISPs technical requirements in order to not discriminate the kinds of traffic, and then transparency also from the regulators. So publish reports. And the reports have to include also traffic management measures and related justification, which is very good, I believe. Let's hope that the devil is not in the detail, because of the reasons we said before. We have not yet been consulted. What happened recently? Recently means 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago there is something else. Someone steps in, not in the European Union landscape, because you know that the Council of Europe is outside the Union, it's something different, even though all 28 countries of the Union have signed to the Convention, to the Charter. They have issued guidelines on traffic management. Do they say the same as our regulation? Roughly. But let's look at the third legal ground. The first one is the same, network integrity and security. The second is the same, network congestion resolution. The third one is far more restrictive. It says just to give effect to an order of a court or regulatory authority, which means that you can prosecute, you can investigate the crime. You can prosecute the crime. You can have state security. You can do that, but you have a further layer of protection, which is the intervention of the judiciary through a court order, which is very important in our perspective. A very important thing is that you have accountability for net neutral implementation, and also that, which is not explicitly provided for in the regulation, that traffic management has to be reviewed by the data protection authorities. So they called upon directly data protection authorities which could be someone could say implicit in what is it is provided for in the regulation, that says without prejudice to the competence of the other authorities that could be competent for the same thing is, but here that's explicit. So let me conclude before giving the floor to the other panelists with some takeaways. Again, traffic management, okay, very limited circumstances, clearly defined by the law, data minimization, necessity, proportionality, no longer than necessary. Cooperation between the national telco regulators and the data protection regulators. Let's play with the privacy directive, meaning that we will have the reform of the privacy directive. I don't know whether some of you were downstairs in the panel on that. It's very important step which could also fix some possible incoherence of the TSM regulation. By the way, we have the new GDPR. So the GDPR on the protection of personal data has a lot of instruments. Let's think of the data protection impact assessment, which will be mandatory for high-risk processing operations. And we might say, let's see how it goes. It depends on who, maybe on certain guidelines of the working party, whether these and could be a really high-risk processing operation. And then the role of the obligation of privacy by design. So the ISP will be data controllers, so the personal data flows through them. Of course, there is also the commerce escape, let's say, clause for intermediary, but if they provide added services, then they come in certainly as controllers. And in that case, in any case, you have to have technical obligations for privacy by design. A very important role will be played also by the research and the standardization. So thank you very much, Estelle, and I think we can go. Sorry for being a bit lengthy, and to give the floor to the others. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thanks. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Maryant. So as Estelle said before, I am an advocacy manager of European digital rights. And insofar as we work on the EU, I'm only going to talk about EU stuff. So from Massimo's presentation, I want you to just keep in mind basic facts. Like first, we have a regulation on that touches upon net neutrality. That we also have recently a regulation that improves data protection standards. And so, as regards net neutrality, the work is not over. And then BEREC now has very important rules, a very important role to make because it will clarify all the uncertainties that Massimo had pointed out. So for the purposes of this panel, I want to focus especially on deep package inspection in the context of traffic management. And also I may perhaps, if I have time, to touch upon zero rating and the privacy concerns. So, as Massimo explained, the principle in the regulation is that all traffic must be treated equally, right? But then, however, the regulation is tricky because it says that specific categories of traffic can be treated differently. And then, regarding a deep package inspection, the regulation says that, on the one hand, that is not required. That means that some ISPs may use it or some ISPs may not. And then, for the purposes of traffic management, ISPs would not need to monitor a specific content. But then the article goes even further, in my opinion, because it says that traffic management measures shall not monitor the specific content. As an anecdote, I think it's very important, well, for me, that to look at different translations of the regulation, and in this case, the Spanish translation goes along with the English one. The Portuguese one as well in a creative way. And then the French translation is very interesting because it says that these measures, well, my rough translation of what it means is that it says that these measures shall not relate to or concern the monitor of a specific content. So we're just talking a lot, or I'm talking a lot about specific content, but what is a specific content or what we think a specific content is? So, as Massimo said, that is not defined in the regulation. BEREC will have to do it, and it's very sad, I think, that the EDPS has not been consulted yet, because EDRi has, and other stakeholders have been consulted. So in order to draft these implementation guidelines, BEREC has to consult not only with stakeholders, but also with the Commission. So we already had a meeting with them. And one of these questions that they asked was especially, I mean, it's interesting because it was about DPI, for example, and what we think it means. So for us, the specific content in the context of DPI needs to be interpreted in a strict way, not allowing invasive data traffic or specific content monitoring techniques for the purposes of traffic management. And so specific content means the type of application or content, for example, an email or a website, but not the actual content sender or receiver. So this would be in line with the regulation and especially in line with the French version, which is clearly in this sense, if we want to interpret it that way. And then on top of this, any monitoring techniques would have to comply with data protection rules, as Massimo said as well, and they also must be transparent. And of course, this is something that the regulation does not clarify in depth. But what I wanted to also touch upon is encryption. Right. So we believe that encrypted traffic should not be considered as an exception of traffic management in the sense that so the principle in the regulation is that only application agnostic network management should be conducted as a principle, and then you have the different exceptions that Massimo explained, right? So in the context of encrypted traffic cannot reasonably be considered a category of content application or service, because any content and practically every application or service can be inside an encrypted data stream. An ISP cannot know what the technical characteristics of the transmitted content, application, or services are, in principle or in theory. In practice, they can make guesses about, for example, thanks to knowing the source and other parameters, they can know, they can make guesses, so they can tell us what they believe they know, right? So therefore, all application-specific forms of traffic management are not applicable to encrypted data traffic. under the TSM, and only application agnostic traffic management measures can be applied to such traffic according to us, and we hope that BEREC will adopt that position. So as a preliminary conclusion, I would say that are net neutrality and privacy mutually reinforcing, as this is the title of this panel? Absolutely yes, in our opinion. Thanks to privacy rules, net neutrality can be rigorously defended. And thanks to net neutrality rules, for example, in the context of DPI, it could be prevented. And then another issue that we think is very important and is usually dealt with in the context of competition is zero rating. Does everybody know what zero rating is? Yes? No? Okay, well, the example that I always put is that imagine that you have a package with your telco and you pay 10 euros, right? So with these 10 euros, they say that you have 2 gigabytes of internet connection. But if you use certain applications such as a Facebook app or, I don't know, Twitter app, the 2 gigabytes would not be deducted. But if you go to other applications, or if you go to your blog post, blog web or whatever, the data will be deducted from those 2 gigabytes. Which means that even though the regulation says that blocking and throttling is not allowed, that could be a way to circumvent that. And so the intention of the regulators in the context of the EU was to not address zero rating. So in principle, it should not be considered as being part of the scope of the regulation. However, when the regulation was adopted, the Commission introduced some confusion because it said that it was, even though the legislators' intention was not that. And then, however, we think that the regulation gives enough means to consider zero rating as being banned, because it could be considered as a commercial consideration. But I'm not going to enter into details into that. But then, even besides those arguments that zero rating could be banned, it also is bad for privacy. For example, in the most famous example of zero rating, we have Internet.org, now rebranded as Free Basics. And so Facebook has a proxy server, and then if your traffic is not encrypted, and for example you don't have, I don't know, let's imagine an Android mobile phone, then the content will have to go through that proxy server and would be unencrypted, and then of course that would be bad for privacy and security. But then I'm a lawyer, so I'm not a specialist on technicalities, so I just now think that Raegan can complement it, and then the tech guys will give you more details about this.
Thanks, Maryant.
You're welcome.
Just to manage expectations, mine isn't going to be very technical either, but we do have technical people that can speak to those details after my talk. So I want to talk about net neutrality as a sort of tool to reinforce privacy, as a policy measure that can help to protect security online in an age of ubiquitous surveillance. So just by way of introduction about Mozilla, we're a community of makers and thinkers and engineers that want to build a better internet. So we build the Firefox web browser and Firefox mobile ecosystem. But Mozilla is also a not-for-profit foundation that does grassroots education and advocacy to empower people to take control over their online life. So for us, being a creator and innovator is very important. So you can see that for us, net neutrality is very important. Traditionally, at least in the net neutrality communities, it is normally seen to be a key to competition. This is basically because when an ISP cannot discriminate traffic, it preserves this innovation without permission principle, which means if you are a creator or an innovator, you have an interesting app, you have a cool website that you want to get out there, you don't have to broker a deal with your telco or your ISP in order to reach an audience. That is the beauty of the internet, and that is what has made it such a dynamic and transformative success. So net neutrality is pretty well recognized for that point of view. But it's also very important for privacy. And so one of the increasing problems that we have in environments where net neutrality either doesn't exist or is not clear or is not enforceable is something that we're seeing whereby there are converging interests in different sectors, by governments, by different companies, to interfere with our traffic, to interfere with our communications. And so there's a number of interests. I think it's pretty clear we know about the government interests, that intelligence service and law enforcement from the NSA, the GCHQ, and all of the friends, all of the eyes, are basically surveilling communications. There's copyright interests. A lot of rights holders put a lot of pressure on intermediaries in order to surveil traffic and take down content. And there's also now increased interest from telcos to look into traffic. So traditionally, and so Maryant already talked about DPI. Traditionally, traffic management didn't have to use deep packet inspection. Basically, traffic. You can conceive of traffic in a way where it's like a letter, right? So there's a header, and then there's the packet information. So if it's a letter, it's the header information is just the basic address, where it's going, where it came from, and then inside of the letter is the content. When you look into the content, then you're talking about deep packet inspection. Traditionally, telcos didn't really use deep packet inspection. They didn't really have an interest in looking into those packets, mostly to prevent liability from them, and it just wasn't really necessary. But increasingly, they also have an interest to look into these packets, and there are basically two reasons. One is discrimination. In order to tier content and services, so Maryant also mentioned zero rating, but there's also other ways of prioritizing content. This is kind of the new way of discriminating content. So one of the more, let's say, traditional or hard ways is blocking and throttling. So we saw that a lot in the EU in the lead up to the telecom single market regulation, where telcos were basically blocking voice over IP services because it was competing with their mobiles. So blocking and throttling were very noticeable ways of discrimination. By the time that the telecom single market was finished, in just about a few years, a new form, a much more nuanced form of discrimination has emerged, whereby telcos like to prioritize certain traffic. So you don't have to block or throttle, but you just raise one above the other. And so in order to do that, you actually have to look into the packet. And so this means then let me just talk about the second reason. The second reason is also ads. So telcos have realized that there is a whole lot of money that can be made based off of collecting information about individuals, what they're doing online. And so there have been a lot of examples of companies like NebuAd and a few others that you've probably never heard of that basically work with ISPs in order to surveil your traffic, what you're doing, where you're going, and this is done through deep packet inspection. So this can interfere with security, because in the age of ubiquitous surveillance, one of the last lines of defense for users is encryption. But if a telco can't actually look into the packet, they don't want you to use encryption. So this can become a really big issue, where users could be faced with a situation whereby they would have to choose between security or speed. And this is a really unfavorable situation. Interestingly enough, this has happened, although it's not very well known, because a lot of traffic management techniques are not very transparent. But in the United States, last year, when the FCC was doing a consultation on the review of the Open Internet rules, a VPN called Golden Frog, in their submission, had basically said that a telco, they didn't disclose which telco, had been discriminating access based on application. So the VPN, which is an encrypted service, was being deprioritized, and it wasn't going through fast enough. So this is a really concerning development, and something that net neutrality can help to avoid, because with net neutrality, you cannot discriminate based on application. So in the EU, the situation is much better, particularly with the ads. So there was a few examples in 2008, 2009 in the UK of these companies like NebuAd and I'm forgetting the name. Is it Form? Form. Yeah, Form. That was tracking users and doing this. Although there was a case that actually I think the EDPS was involved in as well to stop that. And now with the telecom single market regulation, and coupled with the general data protection regulation, there are much more protections for this. And so this is why we see that net neutrality can really play a role in reinforcing privacy and security. The TSM, the Telecom Single Market Regulation, the net neutrality rules that were just passed will certainly improve this situation, but as Maryant and Massimo explained, there are some ambiguities that remain in that the prioritization of traffic is still not totally clear. So we could have this situation, and I'm really glad to hear that the EDPS will be providing commentary from a data protection and privacy perspective on traffic management. But it also reflects why net neutrality is also important not only in Europe but around the world, because there are a lot of more countries increasingly have been passing, either deliberating on or passing net neutrality rules. But there are certainly others that are not, and so we do think that this is a good reason why net neutrality is really important, because not only is it good for competition and innovation, but it can also do a lot to protect your privacy and your right to encrypt. I'll stop there.
It's your turn.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for all being here and filling the room. It's got fuller and fuller, so I can only assuming that what we're saying is getting deeper and more interesting, and I'll try and continue that way, and so the room will be packed by the end. Who here in the room knows what deep packet inspection is? Please raise your hand. It's almost about half the room. It's quite impressive. What is deep packet inspection? If you know what it is, put your hand up. Higher, so we can roughly just see, because there's like maybe 10, 12 people, 15, about half of the room. Does anybody want to prefer a definition of what you think it is? But that's the problem that we're all dealing with, that we're all talking about. No, seriously. You're talking about, on the one hand, a relatively generic technology and a concept like net neutrality where there are a lot of definitions out there. And it's relatively difficult for us talking to you and for you talking to us to say, this is exactly it. And so we're talking in relatively general terms about something that is quite complex and involves essentially a generic norm of how people think the internet should be. So the idea of net neutrality or privacy or encryption. And on the other hand, a relatively generic technology that can do almost anything. And what makes that technology interesting for us in the context of this debate is that it can be used for so many different things. So the potential for the use of deep packet inspection, which is basically a thing that allows you to control the flow of information as it goes through the network, allows you to then also to make decisions about which content is allowed to go through. So forms of freedom of expression can be impacted, censorship, which data will be collected in the process of it going through, so forms of surveillance, and forms of which traffic will be routed in which context based on all manner of factors, which can be used for security, spam filtering, and all sorts of other contexts. And what we've been doing so far is discussing it mainly in a European context. That's to say, in the context of sort of a European implementation of deep packet inspection and wider questions of what that relates to from a normative sense. I think we need to think a little bit also from a more global international context about what it means when you have boxes in a network, so a technical box, a thing that can do all of these things, but that can potentially also be used for many other purposes as well. And so the real question is, that is technically difficult to answer because we don't have the transparency to know in a lot of these contexts, can the thing that is there, let's say, can the technology capacity that is embedded into these networks be misused? And if so, how far? And that's the challenge of a lot of net neutrality regulation that we've seen so far, that one of the main goals has been to increase transparency and to have greater understanding of what's being done in networks. Well, after me, there'll be a slightly more sort of fundamental position on where that could go. But even if you just take the regulation itself, we're in a challenging situation that as users of ISPs, we don't actually know what the people who are entrusted with our data and our traffic are doing with it. So just think about that for a second when you're using the Wi-Fi right now, or your phone or anything else. you don't actually know what the person in between you and the ISP, in between what's happening there. And that's not because that's somehow we're just not quite sure, or there's some mistake that's been made. That's an intentional choice by the providers of services, so that they don't have to tell you in great detail exactly what they're doing with that data. In the vast majority of cases, there are a few good exceptions, but in the vast majority of cases, you as a consumer can't, or only with extreme technical knowledge, can begin to know what is being done with your data, what is being done with your traffic. And that's a challenge, because you're in a situation where you'd like to know more because you care about encryption, you care about privacy, you care about net neutrality, you care about different norms that are held up that you're told are important about the internet, and you can't actually make those choices. And then the flip side of that, of course, is if you don't know what is happening in the network, it might not nearly be as bad as we think it is. So we can't say for sure that the deep packet inspection boxes that are implemented within networks are in every situation going to affect encryption and privacy and all of the other things as well, because nobody actually knows what they're doing. Now, the nobody actually knows what they're doing situation from a regulatory perspective is extremely unsatisfying, and also from an academic perspective. You can't study this, it's very hard to regulate it, and again, it's rather obviously, are there any telcos in the room who'd like to disagree with this? No, okay, that's a shame. I think the panel organizers also tried to get several telcos onto this panel, and it's not always easy to invite them. But it seems to be relatively intentional. That's to say that there's an obvious interest on the side of those who are providing the networks to not provide in the greatest detail exactly what's going on. And there may be certain regulatory reasons for that, but in most cases it's the interest of a private network provider not having to tell you exactly what's happening, and therefore not also being accountable and responsible for that. And so when you look at what's actually happening, are all of our arguments invalidated? If this is like a theoretical discussion and actually it's not that bad? It very much depends on the country that you're looking at. So if you look at places like Tunisia, also in Russia, you can see that there are examples of implementations of deep packet inspection, this potentially all-encompassing control technology, where you have one technological solution which is used for multiple purposes. So you have a technical box sitting somewhere in the network, which is used both for spam management, and the chair falls down, and for filtering and for surveillance, all in one technical box at the same time. So you see in some technical implementation cases that the fears, the problems that are being suggested here are actually true. If you start affecting net neutrality in the network, then you will also have a knock-on effect once the technology is installed, in the sense that it becomes much easier to then use or misuse this technology for other purposes. Particularly interesting is the case in Tunisia, where you have the implementation of a system of internet filtering, also via deep packet inspection. And there it's not so much that it has multiple uses, it's more that there's a great deal of control over it. And that's something for us to think about, in the sense that when the Tunisian government did not pay for the licensing fees, they didn't pay the maintenance fee that was part of the contract for this product, the European company that sold them this product turned the service off. So it's an interesting question also for the EDPS and others. How do we think about our European values when European companies are providing these services around the world? What consequence does that have for these companies when they're trying to live up to European standards, but that only has a monetary and not a normative concern? So how do we ensure that they're living up to the sort of moral and ethical standards when they obviously, at least in some cases, have the technical capacity to influence the operation of these boxes, but that only relates to clauses in the contract where they're actually being disconnected for monetary purposes? And is there an argument to be made that if you have that power, you should also use it for other reasons? That's to say, if the box is being installed, for example, in another country for traffic management purposes or for any other purposes, should there be a purpose limitation that specifically also considers the human rights dimensions? From both data protection and I think broader human rights concerns, there needs to be a serious conversation about that. And I think last of all, and it's perhaps an interesting idea, there's something of the debate that we've had so far in this panel of something like a virtuous triangle. So if you imagine the three parts, which are in some way, you have the idea of net neutrality, you have the idea of the encryption, and you have the idea of privacy. And the idea is that those three can potentially, in a idealized, perfect type of network, could potentially be mutually reinforcing. Because encryption is important, and we know in the context of surveillance, it's one of the only ways that you have to protect yourself. But of course, it's being made so slow by the service provider, then it becomes not particularly useful for you to be able to use this encryption when it's so slow that it's basically meaningless. If you have access to privacy, but you can only use it in the context that is without encryption, that also becomes less meaningful because you don't have technical guarantees for that privacy. And last of all, net neutrality. If you don't have access to encryption, that then also creates all sorts of problems because you have inability to ensure that the other two are being met. So you sort of have a triangle where the one doesn't have to, but likely does in many cases support the other. And of course it depends at a sort of a more general level what sort of internet you imagine. If you hope and believe that your internet service provider is a benevolent being which is likely to act in your interest, then you can feel comfortable and happy and relaxed and not be concerned about what's happening with your data and what's happening with your packets. If you have reason to believe that they might just be a for-profit company that would do whatever they see fit in any legal context, then you might want to have a little bit more of a vision that allows you to have control over that network, or at least you to be able to say what will happen with that network, rather than to be accepting the fact that you have little transparency, accountability, or due process around any kind of decisions that are made with your data and your packets. So that's it for now. I think we'll go now to an example where that is implemented in practice.
Yeah, thank you. So I think what Ben put forward very clearly is that we have a problem of obscurity for many internet access providers. So we don't know what they're doing. They can be putting in place equipment that are very versatile. So they can do a bit of DPI or they can do very nasty things on the network. So I think the question I would like to address is how do we concretely ensure the respect of privacy and freedom of speech by access providers? So how do we ensure that they respect network neutrality? I think at the beginning we had good leads on that, like with the future European regulations, which seem to be bringing some interesting guarantees. I think that's definitely a good way to take, because if we see that an operator is not respecting legal obligations, of course, then we can act on that. I think we can also explore other ways, more concrete ways. So yeah, to just get back on the point, since the access provider is controlling the pipes, they control your rights to privacy and free speech. So since they are able to completely control some of your fundamental rights, it's not normal that they are not accountable for that, because being able to restrict people's fundamental rights, I guess in the democratic countries, should not be something that is up to a private company obscure decisions. So basically in the situation of internet access, in most cases users don't have any power to make sure that their rights are actually respected when they use the internet for communicating. So how could we do that? Considering that even for people with technical skills, it's still not an easy problem. We still need to guess, okay, I'm seeing something weird, I'm going to guess that something is wrong, and I will never have clear answers from my operator. One of the possibilities is for control to for users to be able to control what's happening on networks is to actually be involved in the creation of the network access or the internet access. So what I'm involved in is a local internet access provider in my city in France. And well, we're small and local, but people who are subscribing with us are actually also involved in building the network. We are a non-profit, so we don't need to do DPI for economic reasons. People can ask questions. People are members of their internet access provider. They are not customers, they are members, which means they are inside the structure. And that's a very different relationship. So yeah, my point is basically make people actors of their internet access instead of just consumers. You have such organization in France. We are 20 organizations already like that all over the territory. The local component is very important because we can actually physically gather, discuss, understand what's going on. People can understand why there is not interference. There is no interference on their connection. It's possible to look at the equipment, to ask questions and all this stuff. So as much as possible, people can understand what's going on. So there's a federation of such operators. It's in France, in Belgium. I think in Germany you have also local operators doing these kind of things. And I think, to put it simply, I don't see any other concrete way for users to be sure that their rights are respected when they use their internet connection. It's a bit like encryption. You can always say, okay, probably my ISP is not spying on me, probably, but I don't really know. I just have good hopes. The only method to be sure that they won't be spying on you is to actually use encryption. It's the same with network neutrality. You have to have a direct view on the infrastructure as much as possible to be sure that your data is not interfered with on its way. I think that's my whole point. I can talk more about technical things then.
Well,
Thank you.
very much to all of you for your presentation, which leaves us to a little bit more than 15 minutes for debate. So have you seen several interesting points have been mentioned? So not only deep packet inspection is a key issue when we discuss the intersection of privacy and net neutrality, but also encryption and zero rating. And we've seen that the issue of accountability and transparency on how operators operate the network is actually very important and can be burdensome, this lack of information when we try to regulate, as we have often faced with when we request information with operator either not willing to disclose or giving us the excuse that the information would be too complicated for us to understand anyway. So we're in this situation where we're trying to regulate and make the network as open as possible, as secure as possible, but with only the guarantees of the operators that this is what actually happening, but not having a lot of information on what is the technical parameters on the network. So in order to make sure that you can speak as much as possible and ask all the questions to our panelists, I'll first check in the room if there is any question at that point or if there is any issue you'd like to raise. So we have one question here and one here.
Yeah, I'm Patrick Pennings from the Council of Europe, and thank you, Massimo, for having referred to our most recent recommendation on privacy and net neutrality. In the press, it was also received as a bit, let's say, far-reaching, and the directive, which is maybe true. In any case, there's no contradiction between the two, and that's why the member states of the European Union, which are also the member states of the Council of Europe, even though we have a few more, have accepted to vote for and to accept the recommendation by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Now, I think our starting point, and even though it was only adopted on the 13th of January of this year, it was already in the making for a longer period of time, and actually was postponed, the adoption was postponed, waiting for the directive to come into place. Now, we tried to bring in a number of additional guarantees there, and that is why Massimo clearly pointed to some of it, that is the court orders and also the supervision by data protection authorities. I think that's crucial in this matter, and we're very anxious to try to see how this will work out in practice. Now, we also need to go a little bit further, and I very much like your input at the end. It's not just a question of what will happen and how will data protection authorities deal with this, but also what can we do proactively. And that is maybe through civil society organizations that take an active interest in this, but also institutions need to take action. And what the Council of Europe is doing, and we will release that next week, that's a big study on filtering, blocking, and takedown of internet content, where the first step is going to be a comparative study amongst our 47 member states of the Council of Europe to look at what are the practices, because for the time being the practices are extremely diverse. extremely diverse with regulations on the internet or no regulations, taking down general principles of law. It all depends. So that's the first step. But our intention is really to also go into a more, I would say, a monitoring of the situation, and namely our Secretary General intends to take an initiative, which is an Internet Transparency Initiative, that is to look at regular times how the service providers, but also how governments are actually dealing with the neutrality and the safeguards, human rights safeguards on the internet. And I have no specific question, but I just wanted to share that information with you. Thank you. And I would welcome, of course, if you want to have a little bit more detail about the recommendation of the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. I invite you to visit the website and follow the news maybe also next week, because indeed the study on filtering and blocking and taking down of internet content will be spread next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Can you go to the question here?
Thank you. I'm a student. I'm an engineer by training, but I'm now studying in a Master of Public Policy. I really have two questions. The first one is, since we've said that users lack information to make those informed decisions, what is, and not speaking from a regulatory perspective, but what is, and I'm especially looking at Mozilla here, what is the role that private companies can play to enhance that level of information and through which avenue? So, for example, providing technical services and modules that enable, I know Mozilla does a great deal of that, but how can we spread that not only to non-profit companies or non-profit organizations, but also to other for-profit ISPs? How do we build incentives for them to give more information to the users? And then the second question was more on an international perspective, because there are countries that are not implementing net neutrality, and there are countries that do. And for those that are standing in the middle, what do you think are the political incentives to decide one way or the other? So I'm a developing country, and I don't have a stand on net neutrality as of yet. How do I make that decision, and what are we doing to help develop countries that don't have a position on encryption yet take a stand on net neutrality?
Great, thank you. And does any of you want to answer first? I could also answer a little bit to the second one afterwards. So
Yeah, I can start with the first one. So that's a really good point. How can we, this is something Mozilla thinks of frequently, is like, how can we push our peer companies to do better and to be better? So we're not an ISP, but the concept, which I think, what is good for the user is often good for business. And so with net neutrality, it's pretty clear. In this instance, there are a lot of aligning benefits, where the individual, if you preserve the innovation without permission principle, where people would be free to receive and impart information, that also equally benefits competition. So, the little guys have a chance against the big guys. And so there's that, but I think there's kind of two ways. One is like a regulatory way, which is a little more of like a blunt instrument. So with, the net neutrality rules here that just passed, and frankly, around the world, it's becoming a bigger issue in developed and emerging economies. And one of the reasons is exactly this. So that does that. And then also creating those incentives. I mean, even for telcos, frankly, it's better because networks benefit by being networks, by being connected. So, there's a really great example. I don't know, this looks like a young crowd, but has anyone ever heard of Minitel? Anyone from France here? Yes. Yes. So this was like a pre-internet from France, where it was basically completely controlled. It was a walled garden, completely controlled by a few companies. And do we use Minitel right now? No, because basically it essentially imploded because it was completely controlled by telcos, and they became gatekeepers of what kind of services, what kind of websites, what can you actually access. And in that sense, it didn't actually develop. It didn't spread. It didn't really go around the world. And then we had the World Wide Web that was inherently open. And so this is actually a benefit, especially in the long term, for telcos as well. So it is about showing those incentives. I would say also moving the debate away from conceiving net neutrality as like a philosophical ideal, which happens a lot in these kinds of spaces where it's more just like a technical standard that is what the internet is. So in the absence of that openness and net neutrality, what is the internet? You know, so I think that's the kind of two things, like the regulatory thing and then the incentives. Is just that networks should be networks. And then just that I think innovation can play a role here, especially when we talk about deep packet inspection. And that's kind of a question I wanted to throw to the panel that keeps coming up, is deep packet inspection, is it really necessary? Is it possible to have a network where you don't have to look into the content of the packet? And so Kheops, I love what you're doing, and I love that like tech perspective where it's like, oh, our network, or we can't trust communication, so let's just build our own. And so I think that's great. But what would you say about if that model was scaled up? Would that be possible? And so that's why I think innovation also plays a role here. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to go totally off base, but.
Well, to some extent, I think you answered your own question saying that the internet existed and was working fine before we thought about using deep packet inspection. So I think that's the first bit of an answer. Another bit of answer, I think it's definitely possible to run networks without doing DPI because, well, I do it. It's working. There might be a problem of scale. I don't know. Maybe the business model now the telcos are in almost make them forced to do DPI in order to be profitable. Maybe I don't know for sure. But if that's the case, then they should be thinking of changing their business model. And if we think of this, then maybe how should a computer network be built? Maybe it just economically doesn't work well to have huge companies controlling huge bulks of cables and stuff. Maybe going more local and maybe spreading this approach, like local approach, but globally, having a lot of small locally run networks is, I think it's a very good approach to take. It's for sure a bit, idealistic, and because it requires local human effort indeed, but I think it's definitely an approach that should be explored, especially when you know that now equipment to build networks, you can do it without wires, you can do it with small antennas. It's like you pay $50 for a small antenna, and you can actually do 100 megabits connection between 2 points with two 50 euros antennas. So it's not like it's the crazy expensive thing to do. You need a few people, you need a bit of money, you need a bit of time and knowledge, but it's not horribly difficult. There's one in Brussels here, there's a lot in France. There's a huge network called Freifunk in Germany. That's not technically an ISP though, but still they are building a very interesting network. I think it's spreading and it should be more known. If that's answering your question.
Yeah, well, Maya and Ben will also want to react, and then.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So to your question, I would say that the legislators and regulators already acknowledge that the package inspection is not needed and not required. And then on in relation to transparency, I think even though I think we have like two perspectives. On the one hand, we have the perspective of the regulation, which clearly states that companies should be as much transparent as possible, and even the regulation mentions that internet access services providers should inform on how traffic management measures apply and could have an impact on the quality of the access service and on the privacy of end users.
5 minutes till lunch then.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so we have like the regulatory perspective, and on the other side, I like the contribution saying that we also need to be proactive, not only companies but also civil society. So I don't know if you know that EDRi and other organizations, including Access Now, we built a website called SaveTheInternet.eu. Stay tuned because we're actually working hard in order to update it, so you can be involved in the public consultation of BEREC. And we plan to launch it by the end of March or beginning of April, hopefully. So that's a way that you could tell the regulators that you think the transparency is very needed, because as you, some of you already acknowledged, the transparency is not there. So you can really make things change. And on the other hand, there's also another website that could be very interesting. It's called Respect My Net, where you can really point out to infringements of net neutrality. And I think that's very good. And if you really want to be engaged, there's an opportunity to do that.
So just to build on what's already been said, there was a specific mention of like different models or like these small community-based ISP models, and I don't just think we need to see them in context of being able to use them, but the fact that an ISP can exist in that context and not everybody has to use it is essentially a proof of concept for other ISPs, for other organizations. I think what we're missing a little bit there is a community-owned mobile provider. That's sort of the next step, the next question. It'll be very interesting if that can be developed, and I see many interesting spaces for people who are trying to do that. But that will be sort of if it can be proved that it is possible, it's like Fairphone or like any other product that is attempting to push certain values into the normal market supply chain, that can then be used as an example to say, you may not want to do all of this, large private companies, but you can at least do some of this because it's possible. And so I think we need more examples like that, not just in Europe, but around the world. And also it needs to sort of stay in line with the technology. Second example, for specifically in response to the Council of Europe, the Council of Europe also has a special committee of experts on internet intermediaries, and they specifically looking at one challenge which could broadly be looked at as the challenges related to algorithms having control over large amounts of human beings' data. And you'll find that already when you search on Google, that you don't quite know how the ads are developing in front of your face and what's happening with your data. But I think that we're facing a wider societal challenge, which we see in this case as well, which is that we have people doing things with our information and the packets around us when we use the internet that we can't control, we have no transparency about, and have wide effects on our lives as human beings. And that's a large challenge where I think we need to link up the dots and not just see it in the context of net neutrality and privacy, but also in sort of what sort of societies we want to live in. And then there's a last challenge which is related to encryption, and I think it's important as well. When we talk about encryption, there's a danger, and you see that specifically in the context of Free Basics and Internet.org, that we talk about just any kind of encryption, and that then the type of encryption, Free Basics or Internet.org can then say, yes, but we provide encryption. And the challenge that we already see, again, internet intermediaries, is that more and more players have control over more and more data and traffic within the network, but that makes them also more and more powerful. So mobile providers, people like Facebook, online service providers, who have far too much data in one place for that to be conscionable in a sort of a reasonable context of how that will be trusted, unless it's incredibly transparent and accountable. And so what we need to be thinking about and arguing for in this context, if we want to take those concerns seriously, is actually end-to-end encryption where users have control of the keys. Because if you then assume end-to-end encryption, it completely breaks services like Free Basics because it doesn't provide end-to-end encryption. Facebook has control of the encryption. And to ensure that, again, the user is empowered to use their services also in the context of the things that are being suggested. Please.
Just to say that the trust component is important. We cannot think, I think, in the future that even certain multimodality models, which are very important, will be let's say, the only ones that are present. So even the large companies will have to have, and I think that the transparency pays a lot. Absolutely. So we are going towards, people don't trust the internet yet. We see that. So having someone that provides information and looks, let's say, and gives transparency keys to the public will also be winning the fight in the future, also commercially speaking, just to say that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this session will end now, but we're happy to continue discuss over lunch. I think one interesting thing that I've taken out of this debate is actually we tend to have regulated net neutrality as a response to the interference that telco have been doing on the network. In case of Europe, it was blocking and throttling application. It started in the Netherlands, which created the outrage, and the country reacted by creating net neutrality rules. These types of blocking happening all in Europe was the starting point to create the TSM. But the issue we see now in developing countries is that it's not this type of blocking that's happening, but the interference that is being created right now is the creation of an internet in pieces within free basic like product, where instead of providing access to the full internet, they create a poor access for poor people basically, or we only provide you access to 20 websites that we select, and we choose all the terms of services, and we control the full access to the network, also making surveillance easier. And while we've been able in a Western country to learn from the mistake of the ISP to develop net neutrality rules, if we leave a telco as a company controlling a network and being the gatekeeper of a network, the impact will be much important in the future. And that's why, unfortunately, net neutrality seems to be learned by dramatic lessons. But in the developing countries, the awareness rising on net neutrality is becoming faster and faster, and we see that in India. Because the violation they're facing is much harder than the one we had. They're basically losing access to the full internet for only a few selected websites that they even didn't choose themselves. So hopefully we'll see net neutrality being set as a global standard, which, as Raegan mentioned, it's not necessarily regulating the internet, it's bringing back to what the internet is. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much to all of you and to all the speakers.